March 23, 1945, 9 p.m. Western bank of the Rhine River near Wessel, Germany. The binoculars shook just a little as Aust Wilhelm Steinberg looked at the dark water of the Rhine, writing notes in his field notebook. These notes would later be found among captured German papers at Army Group headquarters. The Americans had reached our sacred river, but they could not cross it. No army had ever forced the Rhine when German soldiers were ready to fight without bridges. As the evening grew darker, he saw something that proved 3 years of Wehrmacht defensive rules. Artillery flashes lit up the western bank. Thousands of guns were getting ready for what German leaders thought would be a normal river attack, which needed days of planning, fixed bridges, and dangerous crossing points. Their 88mm guns could destroy them one by one. In Germany, the Rhine had protected the country for 2,000 years. Even now, with the Reich falling from the east and the west, military engineers told commanders that the river's 1,300-foot width and fast currents made it impossible to cross without long engineering work. 2,000 men of the 51st Highland Division's 7th Battalion, the Black Watch, got ready to go into the water. Not in weak assault boats that would go back and forth under fire, not waiting for engineers to build pontoon bridges under artillery attacks, but in vehicles that German spies had completely failed to understand. The strange boat-shaped trucks called DUKW had been seen in Normandy and Italy, but German analysts thought they were only special landing boats for beaches, and not important for river fighting. The rules of the Rhine defense were about to be broken, not by stronger guns or bigger numbers, but by American industrial cleverness that German soldiers never thought could be used on their last natural fortress. A total failure of intelligence was about to turn Germany's river moat into a highway for Allied tanks. The collapse had started months before in German intelligence reports. Oberst Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, would later testify to Allied interrogators about the Wehrmacht's big mistake in understanding American amphibious abilities. Intelligence reports from Sicily, Salerno, and Normandy had described Schwimmwahn, swimming trucks, but German analysts treated these reports like strange American ideas, such as ice cream ships and Coca-Cola battalions. Among the defenders was Major Hans-Georg Model, son of Field Marshal Walter Model, serving with the 1st Parachute Army. His personal diary, captured after he surrendered in April 1945, would give historians a look at German beliefs about Rhine defense. The Wehrmacht's most experienced officers, men who had studied river crossings from the Danube to the Seine, thought they knew the unchanging rules of amphibious attacks. Attackers needed much stronger artillery, special bridging equipment, and most importantly, time to set up crossing points that defenders could fire at. But the first real proof of German mistakes came in captured documents from their headquarters. Headman Friedrich Wenzel, an intelligence officer with the 15th Army, had written reports on Allied equipment that mentioned the DUKW exactly 3 times in 6 months of papers. Each time they dismissed them as only coastal equipment with no use for river fighting. The reports guessed American forces had maybe 50 to 100 of these vehicles in all of Europe. The real number was shocking. By March 1945, over 2,000 DUKWs worked in Europe. The U.S. Army put them into special amphibious truck units, each with 50 vehicles and trained crews. These units had practiced river crossings since Normandy, making plans German intelligence never noticed. The British got 2,000 DUKWs through Lend-Lease, adding their own ways of using them. Canadian forces had 800 DUKWs with special cold weather changes. The DUKW's creation showed American problem-solving at its best. In April 1942, when a Coast Guard patrol boat ran aground on a sandbar near Provincetown, Massachusetts, normal trucks could not reach it through the surf and sand. This small event started a change in amphibious warfare that would help destroy the Third Reich. Palmer Klett Putnam, working for the Office of Scientific Research and Development, worked with yacht designer Rod Stevens Jr. and engineer Dennis Piston to design a truck that could move easily from water to land. When Ford Motor Company said the project was impossible to finish on time, General Motors Corporation took the challenge on April 23, 1942. The engineering team at GMC's Yellow Truck and Coach Manufacturing Company in Pontiac, Michigan, worked day and night. By June 2, 1942, just 38 days later, the first prototype came out. The vehicle used a standard GMC CCKW 212-ton truck frame with a watertight hull designed by Sparkman and Stevens Yacht Architects. The name DUKW came from GMC's naming system. D stood for 1942 design year, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. The secret of the DUKW's usefulness came from several innovations. Frank Spear from GMC's engineers made the Central Tire Inflation System, CTIS, the first of its kind, letting drivers change tire pressure while moving. At 10 to 12 pounds per square inch, the tires spread wide for sand and mud. At 40 to 45 psi, they were good for roads. A 25-inch propeller, powered through the main transmission's transfer case, pushed the truck in water at 5.5 knots, while a rudder connected to the steering wheel let it move from water to land easily. Major General Jacob Deas watched the first test in June 1942 and immediately ordered mass production. The first order was for 2,000 vehicles. By the end of the war, GMC had made 21,147 DUKWs at an amazing speed of 525 per month at peak, each costing $10,750. That was about the price of 7 Jeeps, but with abilities that would be priceless. By March 1945, Germany's Rhine defenses were in bad shape, which Wehrmacht commanders would not admit, even to themselves. General Alfred Schlemm's 1st Parachute Army, the best German force left in the West, had lost 90,000 men killed, wounded, or captured in the Reichswald battles. The reinforcements coming to defend the Rhine were Volkssturm units, old men and boys with only a few weeks of training, armed with captured weapons and wearing armbands instead of uniforms. Feldwebel Otto Kraus of the 181st Infantry Division near Wessel wrote to his wife on March 20th, "The Americans are across from us now, thousands of them. We hear their vehicles day and night. But the Rhine protects us. Even Napoleon could not cross the Rhine when people fought him. The engineers have destroyed every bridge, and our artillery knows every possible crossing point." The defensive preparations looked very strong on paper. Since September 1944, over 200,000 civilian workers had been forced to work on strengthening the West Wall and extending it toward the Rhine. $3,000. Concrete bunkers and gun positions had been built or reinforced. The river itself was what German rules called the perfect water obstacle. Too wide for assault bridges, too fast for boats, and too deep to wade across. Field Marshal Albert Kessler, who took command in the West after von Rundstedt was dismissed, gave orders that showed German assumptions. The enemy will need 48 to 72 hours to set up safe bridgeheads after first crossing. This time gives us a chance to counterattack with our mobile reserves. These mobile reserves were made of the 47 Panzer Corps, with about 150 working armored vehicles, including tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers, all covering a front of nearly 200 meters. But the biggest German mistake was in thinking. Wehrmacht rules, shaped over 5 years of war, saw river crossings as step-by-step operations. First, use artillery to suppress defenders. Then send infantry and assault boats. Make small bridgeheads. Start building bridges under fire. Send more troops as bridges were ready. Finally, send tanks across. Each step gave defenders a chance to fire on attackers and counterattack. What German intelligence did not know was that the Allies had gathered the largest number of amphibious vehicles ever along the Rhine's western bank. By March 22, 1945, hundreds of DUKWs were hidden within 5 miles of planned crossing points. Each vehicle was waterproofed, checked for mechanical problems, and loaded with specific cargo to keep it balanced in water. Lieutenant Colonel William Thompson, in charge of the 458th Amphibious Truck Company, remembered the careful preparation. "We knew this was not Normandy with tides and beach obstacles. The Rhine was all about current, about exit points, about working with artillery so we didn't get hit by our own shells. We practiced for 2 weeks on the Maas River, learning how the DUKWs handled fast currents. The vehicles had been changed based on 3 years of fighting experience. Armor plates protected drivers and important parts. Ring mounts for 50 caliber machine guns gave self-defense. Most important, special bilge pumps could handle water from small arms fire, letting DUKWs keep working even if their hulls were shot. Captain James Mitchell of the 819th Amphibious Truck Company described the final briefing. They told us we were going to do something nobody had ever done before. Use DUKWs as the main assault vehicles for a big river crossing. Not support boats, not supply trucks after bridges were built, but the actual front of the attack. Each DUKW would carry a full rifle squad with all their equipment, cross the Rhine, drive up the eastern bank, and drop troops right into fighting positions. The British forces had their own amphibious vehicles. The 79th Armored Division, led by Major General Percy Hobart, brought 600 LVT-4 Buffalo amphibious tractors, each able to carry 30 men. These would work with the American DUKWs in what would become the largest amphibious river crossing in military history. But it was the DUKWs, with their ability to move easily from water to land, that would surprise the Germans the most. At 5 p.m. on March 23, 1945, the biggest artillery attack of the Rhine campaign started. Over 4,000 Allied guns, from 25-pounders to 240mm howitzers, fired a 4-hour barrage that felt like the air itself had turned into a wall of steel and explosions. German observers said the eastern bank looked like it was boiling under the impact of thousands of shells every minute. Gerrit Hinrich Müller, at an observation post near Wesel, tried to count the muzzle flashes across the river. I stopped at 500. It was like a solid line of fire stretching north and south as far as I could see. The noise was impossible to describe, not separate explosions, but one constant roar that made thinking impossible. Under the cover of this bombardment and darkness, the first DUKWs went into the Rhine at 9 p.m. The 51st Highland Division led the attack, with the 7th Battalion Black Watch loaded into DUKWs driven by American crews. Each vehicle carried 12 fully equipped soldiers plus its 2-man crew. Navigation lights, hidden so only those behind could see, marked the entry and exit points on both banks. Sergeant Robert McPhersonson of the Black Watch described the crossing. We rolled down the bank and suddenly we were floating. The American driver kept driving like we were still on land, except now water was rushing past. The engine was loud, and we could hear German shells hitting the water around us, but we couldn't see anything in the darkness and smoke. The current was stronger than expected, 8 to 10 knots in the main channel. The current in the main channel was strong. DUKWs started upstream of where they were supposed to land, with their drivers calculating drift like pilots plotting courses in crosswinds. Some vehicles were carried hundreds of yards downstream, but because they could drive up any bank that wasn't too steep, they could get out of the river wherever they ended up. By 10:01 p.m., the first wave had crossed. German defenders, expecting to hear assault boats returning for a second wave, instead only heard the constant roar of artillery. The DUKWs had driven straight up the eastern banks and vanished into the darkness, their soldiers already attacking German positions from directions no one expected. When dawn came on March 24th, German commanders started getting reports that made no sense. Enemy troops were appearing miles inland from the crossing points, in full battalion strength, with heavy weapons and supplies. The expected pattern of slowly growing bridgeheads had not happened. Instead, Allied forces seemed to be everywhere at once. Headman Karl Richet, in charge of a battery of 88mm guns covering the crossing at Rhine, reported to divisional headquarters, "Enemy armor is behind us. Repeat, enemy armor is behind our position." How did they get across? All bridges are destroyed. We have seen no pontoon construction. What the Reich faced were not tanks, but DUKWs carrying infantry, support weapons, mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank guns, moving directly from the Rhine to positions 3 miles inland. The vehicle's amphibious ability let them bypass German strongpoints, defending obvious river routes. The size of the operation became clear as the morning fog lifted. Hundreds of DUKWs were crossing the Rhine in constant streams. Unlike assault boats that needed engineers and could only cross at prepared spots, DUKWs could go in and out of the river wherever the banks allowed. German artillery observers reported swimming trucks crossing at dozens of points along a 22-mile front. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, operations officer for the 185th Division, wrote in his war diary, "The enemy has used a type of amphibious vehicle in numbers we never expected. Our plan assumed 6 to 8 crossing points we could hit with concentrated fire. Instead, they are crossing everywhere. Our guns cannot fire at so many targets at the same time." The British Second Army's crossing at Wesel used a deadly mix of DUKWs and Buffalo LVTs. The 15th Scottish Division crossed in Buffaloes, while DUKWs carried their heavy weapons and supplies. By 8 a.m., despite tough resistance from the 1st Parachute Army, by 10 a.m. on March 24th, 3 full divisions had crossed the Rhine with all their equipment. At the same time, the roar of aircraft engines added to the noise of battle. Operation Varsity, the biggest single-day airborne operation in history, began as a massive air fleet appeared over the Rhine. The operation used more than 1,700 transport planes and over 1,350 gliders carrying 16,000 paratroopers and glider troops. This was not the small paratroop drop the Germans expected, but a coordinated attack designed to work with the river assault. Oberreiter Franz Weber of the 84th Infantry Division watched from near Hammenkelln. The sky turned dark with planes. Parachutes opened like flowers, thousands and thousands of them. We thought this was the main attack, and that the river crossings were just distractions. Then we found out the Americans were already 10 kilometers behind us with their swimming trucks. The airborne forces, the U.S. 17th Airborne and British 6th Airborne Divisions, landed within artillery range of the Rhine crossings, something German commanders did not expect. Earlier airborne operations had dropped troops far behind enemy lines to act on their own. This time they landed only 6 miles from the river, directly helping the amphibious forces. The teamwork between airborne and amphibious forces made them much stronger. DUKWs carrying ammo and medical supplies went straight to the airborne positions, which in older operations would have needed air supply or meeting with ground forces. Days later, wounded paratroopers were evacuated in DUKWs going back to the Western Bank, which was impossible in traditional airborne operations. Private First Class Donald Burgett of the 17th Airborne later wrote, "We were fighting for this crossroads when these weird-looking truck boats came driving up. No splashing, no getting stuck. They just drove out of the woods like normal trucks, except we knew they had just crossed the Rhine." The crew chief yelled, "Anybody need ammo?" We thought we were dreaming. By noon on March 24th, the full impact of the DUKW assault became clear to German commanders. This was not just a new way to cross rivers. It was a total change in amphibious logistics that destroyed all their old defensive ideas. Normal river crossings needed steps: assault crossing, securing the bridgehead, building bridges, and finally bringing supplies. Each step was open to counterattack. Once bridges were built, they became easy targets for artillery and airstrikes. The DUKWs removed all these weak points. Lieutenant Colonel George Sims, logistics officer for the 16th Corps, had set up what he called DUKW highways across the Rhine. Vehicles loaded on the western bank with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel simply drove into the river, crossed, and delivered directly to combat units. No unloading at the riverbank, no changing vehicles, no waiting for bridges. "We were running 50 DUKWs per hour at our crossing point," Sims reported. Each carried 2.5 tons of supplies or 25 men. That is 125 tons of supplies or 1,250 troops every hour, all day and all night. The Germans kept looking for bridges to bomb, but there weren't any, just trucks driving through the water. The psychological effect on German defenders was terrible. Feldwebel Hermann Gutz of the 2nd Parachute Regiment wrote in his diary, "They have unlimited vehicles that swim. How do you stop an army that can turn any river into a road? We blow up bridges for nothing. They don't need bridges." Supply sergeants reported unbelievable experiences. Technical Sergeant Anthony Russo of the 30th Infantry Division described setting up a supply dump. We're 3 miles from the Rhine on the German side, right? And here comes a DUKW straight from the water, dripping wet, carrying hot food in insulated containers. The cooks on the western bank had prepared the meal, loaded it in the duck, and it drove straight to us. Hot coffee in the middle of a battle. The Germans must have thought we were crazy. March 25th began with German commanders facing a situation Wehrmacht rules had never planned for. The Rhine, Germany's historic barrier, had become useless. Not conquered, not broken, but simply bypassed by American industrial skill that German intelligence had thought was just a curiosity. General Alfred Schlemm, leading the 1st Parachute Army, held a commanders' meeting that morning in a farmhouse near Brunn. The surviving record of this meeting, gathered from captured officers' testimonies, shows how shocked the Germans were. Schlemm reportedly said, "Gentlemen, we prepared to fight the last war. We assumed the enemy would attack our fortress. Instead, they drove around it. The numbers were amazing. In the first 48 hours, DUKWs had carried over 15,000 troops across the Rhine. Even more important, they had moved 200 vehicles, jeeps, trucks, and light armor, things that traditional crossing methods could not have delivered for days. Artillery guns were being brought across and firing from the eastern bank before German intelligence even knew the crossings had happened. Obus Hinrich von Lüttichau, leading what was left of Panzer Brigade 106, tried to counterattack near Wesel on March 25th. His unit's war diary says, "Attacked toward river to destroy enemy bridgehead. Found no bridgehead in the usual sense. Enemy forces were spread across a 15-kilometer front with no clear center. Swimming vehicles kept reinforcing every point. Impossible to find a critical target. Attack failed with heavy losses." The British were having similar success. The Scottish divisions had pushed 6 miles inland by the end of March 25th, helped by constant DUKW supply runs. Royal Artillery forward observers were calling in fire missions while riding in DUKWs, using the truck's mobility to avoid German counterfire. The Rhine crossing clearly showed the industrial difference between American mass production and German craftsmanship philosophy. German engineers had made their own amphibious vehicle, the Landswerk LWS. In many ways, it was better than the DUKW. It could carry 20 men compared to the DUKW's 25, but had stronger armor. Its track design worked better in mud and snow. German engineers had solved hard problems like waterproofing tracks and making reliable bilge pumps. As a piece of engineering, it was amazing. But Germany had made only about 100 units total, with even fewer used in battle. The LWS needed special parts, skilled craftsmen to build it, and rare materials for its armor and waterproofing. Each unit cost about 75,000 Reichsmarks, 7 times the cost of a DUKW. Meanwhile, General Motors had made 21,147 DUKWs using normal truck parts and assembly line methods. The DUKW shared its engine, transmission, axles, and many other parts with the standard CCKW truck, of which 562,150 were built. This meant any mechanic who knew military trucks could fix a DUKW. Spare parts were easy to get. Broken vehicles were quickly repaired or taken apart for parts. Master Sergeant Edwin Coleman, maintenance chief for the 492nd Amphibious Truck Company, explained the advantage. "We kept 90% of our ducks running during the crossing. When something broke, we had the parts. When we didn't have the exact parts, we could use something from a regular truck. Try doing that with some special German wonder weapon." The production idea went beyond just numbers. American DUKWs were made to be easy to use. Any soldier who could drive a truck could learn to run a DUKW in a few hours. German vehicles needed crews with a lot of training. American mass production assumed the drivers would be normal soldiers with little training. German design assumed professional soldiers with months of practice. Personal stories from both sides of the Rhine show the human side of this technical and tactical change. These were not just production numbers or strategy ideas. These were young men living the change in war in real time. Private First Class James H. of the 89th Infantry Division remembered his first view of the DUKWs. "We were lined up on the west bank, ready to squeeze into assault boats under fire like we trained. Then these things that looked like boats with wheels came rolling down the bank. A Navy man, yeah, Navy, right in the middle of Germany, waved us aboard. I asked him, "What the hell is this thing?" He grinned and said, "Your taxi to Berlin, soldier." The fact that U.S. Navy people were driving DUKWs deep in Europe added to German confusion. Seaman Second Class Robert Moody, assigned to a naval unit running DUKWs for the Rhine crossing, described the German reaction. "We captured some Germans who just stared at our Navy uniforms." One who spoke English kept asking, "How is the American Navy here? The ocean is 300 miles away." He just could not understand what he was seeing. German accounts show growing demoralization as the size of American amphibious power became clear. Lieutenant Friedrich Schulzer of the 338th Infantry Division wrote in a letter found after his unit surrendered, "They came across the river like it was a street. Not sneaking, not rushing between artillery barges, but driving. Trucks full of soldiers driving through the Rhine. We shot at them, but more kept coming. Always more." Where did they get so many? Unreitzia Paul Brown, captured on March 26, told interrogators, "We were told the Rhine would stop you for weeks, that you would have to build bridges we would destroy, that your assault boats would be easy targets for our guns. Nobody told us about swimming trucks. Nobody warned us you could cross anywhere, anytime. We prepared for the wrong war." By March 26, 1945, the German commanders faced a reality their doctrine had not imagined. Just 732 hours after the first DUKW entered the Rhine, the German defensive position had completely collapsed. What Wehrmacht doctrine said would take weeks had been done in only 3 days. The Rhine barrier, which German propaganda claimed would hold until negotiations could save something of the Reich, had disappeared. The numbers from those 3 days showed how big the change was. DUKWs had completed over 5,000 individual crossings. They had moved 15,000 troops, 1,200 vehicles, 3,000 tons of supplies, and had evacuated 2,000 wounded soldiers. Traditional bridge operations, if they had been needed, would have taken 2 weeks to do the same work while under constant attack. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, often criticized for being too careful, had achieved complete surprise by using massed numbers of amphibious vehicles. His after-action report said, "The enemy expected us to cross the Rhine. They did not expect us to drive across it. That difference destroyed their defense." General Dwight Eisenhower visited the crossing sites on March 26. His reaction, recorded by his aide Captain Harry Butcher, was telling. Ike watched the DUKWs moving back and forth like a ferry service. He turned to Bradley and said, "With these things, every river in Germany is now a highway." Bradley replied, "The Germans are just figuring that out." The psychological collapse was total. Joseph Goebbels' diary entry for March 26 read, "The situation in the West has become impossible. The enemy has crossed the Rhine along a broad front with a new kind of amphibious vehicle we did not expect. Our last natural barrier is gone. The war is lost." On March 27, the Allies fully used the Rhine breakthrough. With German forces in total confusion, Allied commanders sent forward their mobile units. The DUKWs, having finished their amphibious mission, now showed another ability. They could work as normal trucks, moving with the armored spearheads. The U.S. 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels, had been moved across in record time. Tank crews described the strange experience of following DUKWs that had just come out of the Rhine, still dripping water, as they raced down German autobahns. The amphibious vehicles carried fuel and ammunition directly to advancing tank units, removing the usual pause to stock supplies after a river crossing. Major General Isaac White, commanding the 2nd Armored, reported, "We advanced 50 miles on March 27 alone. In any earlier operation, we would have been waiting for bridges to be built and supplies to be collected. Instead, the DUKWs kept up with us every step of the way. They would cross rivers we found, scout for crossing sites, and set up supply points before our main forces even arrived." German resistance fell apart into small isolated pockets. Units that had been ready to attack bridgeheads found themselves bypassed by Allied forces that seemed to be everywhere at once. The strict German defensive rules, based on finding and destroying fixed crossing points, had no answer for hundreds of amphibious vehicles making their own crossing points wherever they wanted. Oberst Hans von Luck, one of Germany's most experienced armored commanders, met American forces near Dorst on March 28. His memoir describes the encounter. "My battalion was racing to set up a blocking position when we ran into American troops already dug in. I asked a captured lieutenant how they had moved so fast. He pointed to a line of those amphibious trucks and said, 'We don't wait for bridges.' That's when I really understood that Germany had lost more than a battle. We had lost a whole way of fighting." The full impact of the DUKWs on the Rhine crossing goes beyond the amazing numbers of vehicles and supplies moved. The amphibious trucks completely changed how river attacks worked, giving advantages that added up very fast. Normal river crossings focused forces at one place, making them easy targets for artillery and air attacks. The DUKWs spread crossings along the whole front, reducing the effect of German fire. Wehrmacht rules said to counterattack bridgeheads before they could grow stronger. But there were no real bridgeheads, just a constant flow of vehicles crossing all along the river. Colonel William Thompson, who led DUKW operations for the 9th Army, calculated the time saved. Building a big pontoon bridge under fire usually took at least 12 to 24 hours. During that time, you could only reinforce by assault boats, maybe one company per hour if lucky. We were moving a whole battalion per hour with DUKWs from the very first minute. The medical effect was huge but often forgotten. Captain Dorothy Anderson, a nurse with the 45th Field Hospital, described the evacuation system. Wounded soldiers were loaded into DUKWs on the eastern bank and driven straight to our hospital on the western side. No switching vehicles, no waiting for bridges. We were getting casualties to surgery within an hour of being wounded, something impossible in normal river crossings. The DUKWs also allowed new tactics that could not be done with regular crossing methods. Artillery forward observers could move quickly in DUKWs, making German counterfire useless. Engineers used DUKWs to carry bridge sections, actually speeding up normal bridge building, even while making bridges less important. Radio relay stations and DUKWs kept communications working across the river. After the war, analysis showed how badly German intelligence had misunderstood American amphibious abilities. The Wehrmacht had seen DUKWs in many operations: Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, Normandy, but never understood what they could do for river crossings. General Major Reinhard Gehlen, chief of the Foreign Army East and later founder of West German intelligence, wrote in his memoirs, "We catalogued American equipment carefully. We knew about the DUKW. We just never imagined they would use hundreds of them at once for a river crossing. Our thinking was limited by our own problems. Because we could only make a few amphibious vehicles, we assumed the Americans had the same limits." Captured German intelligence files showed systematic underestimation. A February 1945 report by Army Group H estimated the Allies had only 100 to 150 amphibious vehicles for river use. The real number was over 2,000 in the 21st Army Group alone. Another report said DUKWs were only good for supply operations after beaches were secure, not for attacks. The failure went beyond numbers. German intelligence never found the specialized amphibious truck companies, never saw their river training, and never understood the new tactics being used. They were getting ready to fight the river crossing they expected, not the one that actually happened. Major Joachim Engelmann, intelligence officer for the 1st Parachute Army, said after being captured, "We studied every Allied river crossing from the Rapido to the Seine. We thought we understood their methods. Using so many amphibious vehicles at once was not in our calculations. It was like they had found a way to fly tanks across the river, totally outside our understanding." Even with the tactical and technical advantages shown at the Rhine, the crossing was not without loss. The human cost, though much lower than traditional attacks would have caused, was still serious. Allied casualties for Operations Plunder and Varsity totaled 6,681, 3,168 British and Commonwealth, 2,113 American. The airborne forces suffered heavily from anti-aircraft fire, and some planes were shot down before troops could jump. The 17th Airborne Division lost 430 soldiers killed in action in a single day. DUKWs evacuating wounded soldiers came under German artillery fire, and several vehicles were lost with everyone inside. Oskar Friedenson, a combat engineer with the 89th Infantry Division, described his unit's crossing at St. Gorshausen on March 26. "We lost 250 men out of 420 trying to take our sector. The DUKWs got us across quickly, but the Germans were waiting on the high ground with machine guns and mortars. Going fast doesn't make you bulletproof." German casualties were huge. The 1st Parachute Army basically stopped existing as a fighting force. Over 16,000 soldiers were captured in the first 72 hours. Many simply left their positions when they saw that the Rhine barrier had failed. Whole units were trapped as DUKWs moved forces behind them. Gerrit Vera Hoffmann of the 84th Infantry Division was captured on March 25. His questioning showed the psychological effect. "We held our positions for 2 days, firing at crossing sites. Then Americans appeared behind us. When we asked prisoners how they crossed, they pointed at those swimming trucks. Our lieutenant dropped his weapon and said, 'If they can drive trucks across the Rhine, the war is over.'" Nobody disagreed. One of the most remarkable events of the Rhine crossing happened on March 25, when Prime Minister Winston Churchill insisted on crossing the Rhine himself. This wasn't just for show. Churchill understood how important it was that Allied armies had crossed Germany's sacred river. Churchill, with Field Marshal Montgomery and General Alan Brooke, first watched the crossings from a ruined railway bridge at Wesel. Then, against the strong advice of his security team and Eisenhower's orders, Churchill got into an American LCVP landing craft and crossed to the eastern bank. Montgomery's aide, Lieutenant Colonel Trumbull Warren, wrote about the scene. "The Prime Minister was completely determined. He said, 'I'm going to cross the Rhine. I've waited years for this moment.'" The American crew was shocked when they realized who was aboard, but Churchill was already seated, cigar in his teeth, flashing V for victory signs. For 30 minutes, the British Prime Minister stood on German soil east of the Rhine while German artillery shells landed close enough to spray them with debris. Churchill reportedly picked up a handful of soil and said, "German soil." At last, the crossing wasn't really needed for fighting, and it was risky, but it had huge psychological power. The leader of Britain was standing on German land they had just taken. This event showed another benefit of the amphibious assault. Churchill could cross because DUKWs and landing craft were always moving. If they had used traditional bridges, this crossing would have required stopping all military traffic on an important bridge. The spread-out nature of the amphibious operation made Churchill's dramatic gesture possible. The Rhine crossing's success sped up the end of the European war by about 3 weeks, according to post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey. This speed wasn't just because they crossed the river, but because the operation was fast and wide, thanks to the amphibious vehicles. Traditional river crossing rules would have required steps one after another. Establish small bridgeheads, build bridges under fire, slowly send in reinforcements, and then move forward after getting supplies ready. Even if successful, this would have taken at least 2 to 3 weeks. German forces would have had time to make new defenses, destroy key bridges and factories, or even try to negotiate. Instead, the Allies did in 72 hours what German planners thought would take weeks. By March 26, 3 Allied armies were racing into Germany's heartland. The Ruhr, Germany's industrial center, was surrounded. By April 1st, the Allies were moving so fast that Germans couldn't destroy factories, bridges, or supplies that could have kept fighting going longer. General Omar Bradley figured out how many lives were saved. "If we had crossed the Rhine the old way, assault boats, engineers building bridges under fire, slow reinforcements, we would have lost at least 50,000 men." The DUKWs turned what could have been a bloodbath into a moving supply exercise. The effect spread to the east, too. Soviet forces, seeing the Rhine crossing succeed, sped up their own advance toward Berlin, not wanting the Western Allies to take the Nazi capital first. This race between East and West, which shaped post-war Europe, was pushed faster by DUKWs crossing the Rhine. By March 28, 1945, German command in the west had completely broken down. Communications failed as headquarters retreated or were captured. The speed of the Allied advance, powered by the Rhine crossing, stopped any organized German defense. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, found his forces trapped and split in the Ruhr pocket. His last order, issued on March 29th, showed how desperate the situation had become. The enemy had done the impossible at the Rhine. Any further fighting would only make things worse. I release all soldiers from their oath. Save yourselves as best you can. Model committed suicide on April 21st rather than surrender. The psychological collapse was complete. German soldiers who had fought fiercely for every village now gave up in large groups. The Rhine had legendary importance. Its loss meant the war was truly over. Units that could have tried guerrilla fighting just disappeared. Civilian morale, already broken by bombing, completely collapsed. The Rhine crossing showed that no natural barrier could protect Germany. If the Rhine could be crossed in just 3 days, what was the point of keeping up resistance? Local officials began negotiating the surrender of their towns to avoid destruction. Hans Frank, the Nazi governor-general of Poland, wrote in his diary, "The Rhine is crossed. The sacred river that protected Germany for 2,000 years has fallen in 72 hours. If there was any doubt about our future, it is gone. We face not just defeat, but total destruction." The Rhine crossing completely changed how military leaders thought about amphibious operations. Before March 1945, amphibious attacks were mostly about sea invasions, Normandy, Pacific island hopping. The Rhine showed that amphibious abilities were just as powerful on land in Europe. The U.S. Army's official history concluded that using DUKWs in large numbers at the Rhine represents a revolution in military thinking, similar to when tanks first appeared in World War I. The ability to treat rivers as roads instead of obstacles completely changes how armies plan operations. Soviet observers attached to Allied headquarters took careful notes. Colonel Ivan Yakushin reported to Moscow, "The Americans solved the river crossing problem through industrial mass production. They simply built so many amphibious vehicles that rivers don't matter anymore. This affects any future war in Europe." The British Army, even though it joined the operation, studied it closely afterward. Brigadier Richard Goodbody wrote, "We must never again assume rivers give any real defense against an enemy with proper amphibious equipment." The Rhine crossing proved that industrial capacity beats geographic advantage. While generals got the credit for the Rhine crossing, the real heroes were the DUKW crews who made it possible. These men, many from U.S. Navy units, found themselves in the middle of Germany operating what were basically floating targets. Seaman First Class Joseph Bernardini of Naval Unit 350 described a typical crossing. "You're driving this big, slow target across 1,300 feet of open water. German 88s are shooting at you. Mortars are dropping all around. Machine guns are trying to hit you. You can't zigzag much or the current will push you away. You just hold the wheel, push the throttle, and pray." The maintenance crews worked miracles to keep the DUKWs running. Working under fire, often in the dark, they repaired holes in the hull, replaced propellers damaged by debris, and kept engines running even though soaked with Rhine water. Master Sergeant Thomas Riley of the 458th Amphibious Truck Company Maintenance Section said, "We patched holes with anything we could find. Ration cans hammered flat, chunks of German armor, even wooden plugs. If it floated and moved, we kept it running." British DUKW crews trained by Americans added their own ideas. Sergeant Major William Davies of the Royal Army Service Corps came up with a way to use DUKWs to rescue crews from destroyed tanks. "We'd drive right up to burning tanks, use our vehicle as a shield, and pull wounded tankers aboard. The water dripping from our hull helped with the heat. We saved dozens of men that way." After the war, German military experts studied their defeat carefully. The Rhine crossing was featured in these studies as much a failure of imagination as of material. General Franz Halder, former chief of the General Staff, wrote in 1948, "We prepared extensively for the Allied Rhine crossing. We positioned reserves, registered artillery, prepared demolitions. We did everything correctly according to our rules. We simply never imagined the enemy would have hundreds of vehicles that could ignore the river completely. The Wehrmacht's final operational study, done by imprisoned German officers in 1946, admitted, the American use of amphibious vehicles in large numbers represents a type of warfare we neither expected nor could stop with what we had. Even if we had known, German industry could not have made as many. The Rhine crossing was lost in Detroit factories, not on the riverbanks. Colonel General Heinz Guderian, father of German armored warfare, gave perhaps the best insight. We Germans perfected the art of warfare. The Americans perfected the business of warfare. At the Rhine, business beat art. Their swimming trucks were not elegant, not sophisticated, but they were many and effective. That is the American way of war. Even though it was so important. The DUKW's role in crossing the Rhine has often been overshadowed by other dramatic events. The capture of the Remagen Bridge, the huge airborne operation, and Montgomery's set-piece battle. Yet veterans knew the true importance of the amphibious truck. General Dwight Eisenhower, in his memoir Crusade in Europe, wrote, "Analysts will debate what shortened the war most: strategic bombing, Soviet pressure, or Allied unity. I believe historians underestimate the simple DUKW. Without it, the Rhine would have been a killing ground. With it, we drove into Germany like tourists on holiday." The DUKWs kept serving after the Rhine. They crossed the Elbe, the Danube, and many smaller rivers. They helped evacuate concentration camp survivors too weak to walk. They delivered food to starving civilians in isolated areas. Vehicles that had broken Germany's last barrier now saved lives. Technical Sergeant Paul Morrison of the 336th Amphibious Truck Company remembered using his DUKW after Germany surrendered. The same vehicle that crossed the Rhine under fire was now bringing food to German children in flooded areas near Hamburg. The kids had never seen anything like it. A truck that could swim. They would chase us, shouting, "Swim wagon, swim wagon." Funny how something built for war ended up saving lives. The 21,147 DUKWs built during World War II were more than just vehicles. They showed American industrial thinking. While German engineers aimed for perfect vehicles in small numbers, American factories built good enough vehicles in huge numbers. This idea applied beyond DUKWs. The same factories made 2.5-ton trucks at $10,000 per month. The steel for DUKW hulls came from mills that made Liberty ships every 42 hours. The engines were made on assembly lines that could quickly switch from truck engines to aircraft or tank engines. Donald Nelson, chairman of the War Production Board, visited a DUKW line in 1944. He said, "In 1 hour, I watched 6 DUKWs completed. Rough welds, simple solutions, painted olive drab. Not perfect by German standards, but each one would cross the Rhine. German factories would spend a month making one perfect amphibious vehicle. We built 180 good enough ones in that time." The German Landwasser Schlepper, LWS, showed the limits of craft production. Each LWS needed specialized workers, custom parts, and lots of testing. When Allied bombing hit supply lines, production stopped. DUKW production just swapped parts and kept going. The success at the Rhine echoed through the last weeks of the war, showing how industrial thinking could defeat even the strongest natural and man-made defenses. German units all over the Reich learned that the Western Allies had crossed their last barrier with ease. Morale, already weak, completely collapsed in Italy. German troops who had held mountain positions for months suddenly started pulling back, Field Marshal Kessler reported. News of the Rhine crossing caused instant drops in troop morale. Soldiers ask, if the Rhine cannot stop them, what can? He had no answer. German forces in Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, though bypassed, began negotiating local surrenders. The myth of the impregnable Rhine had kept hope for negotiated peace alive. Its fall in just 72 hours made further resistance meaningless. Even in Berlin, under Soviet siege, the Rhine crossing had an effect. Hitler's final recorded military conference on April 27th included his complaint. The Rhine was lost because we didn't expect their amphibious vehicles. We prepared for the Wrong war. Perhaps it was his only correct military assessment of the entire conflict. At a 1985 reunion of Rhine, crossing veterans in Lexington, Kentucky, aging soldiers gathered to remember those 3 days that ended Nazi Germany's last hope. The DUKWs, a few preserved as monuments, drew particular attention. Former Sergeant James Mitchell, who commanded a DUKW in the 819th Amphibious Truck Company, stood beside one. Ugly thing, isn't it? He said, like a boat and a truck had a baby that was neither. But this ugly duckling swam the Rhine when the Nazis thought it impossible. We didn't outfight them. We outproduced them, out-innovated them, out-imagined them. Former Oberleutnant Hans Müller, who had defended the Rhine with the 181st Infantry Division, attended as an invited guest. His speech to the veterans was striking. "You brought swimming trucks to a river battle. We brought anti-tank guns to stop them. The moment I saw those vehicles driving out of the Rhine, I knew the war was over, not lost. Over. You cannot fight an enemy who turns your strongest defense into a highway." The reunion highlighted a profound truth. The Rhine crossing succeeded not just through courage or tactics, but through industrial power and innovation. The heroes were as much the assembly line workers in Pontiac as the soldiers in Germany. March 23 to 26, 1945, marked more than a successful military operation. It represented the triumph of American industrial democracy over German military aristocracy, mass production over craft perfection, and practical innovation over rigid doctrine. The DUKW was truly American, not the best amphibious vehicle possible, but the best that could be mass-produced with existing technology. It solved problems through quantity instead of perfection, through standardization rather than specialization. The DUKW was operated by citizen soldiers with minimal training rather than professional warriors with years of experience. This approach shocked German military professionals. General von Runet in British captivity complained, "War has become a factory manager's business rather than a general's art. Your swimming trucks were not weapons of war but products of industry. You defeated us, not on the battlefield but in the factory." Yet this change was exactly the point. America had democratized warfare, just as it had democratized production. The DUKW represented not just military ability but industrial thinking, the idea that any problem could be solved through enough production properly organized. The final tally of the Rhine crossing shows the DUKW's decisive effect. Vehicles involved included hundreds of DUKWs in direct Rhine crossing operations, 600 British Buffalo LVTs in support, more than 2,000 DUKWs available. In theater, about 100 German LWS produced. Few operational transportation achievement from March 23 to 31, 1945 included more than 15,000. Troops moved across 200 vehicles, transported 3,000. Tons of supplies delivered 2,000. Wounded evacuated and over 5,000 individual DUKW crossings completed. Production comparison shows 2,147 DUKWs built by the USA and 562,150 standard trucks sharing DUKW parts. About 100 LWS built by Germany with 0 vehicles specifically for river assault. Time factors: 38 days from DUKW concept to prototype, 72 hours to breach Rhine defenses, 3 weeks of war shortened by the rapid crossing, 50,000 estimated Allied casualties prevented. Cost analysis: $10,550 per DUKW, 75,000 Reichsmarks per LWS, 7-to-1 cost ratio favoring American production. Infinite advantage in actual use. The DUKW's role in crossing the Rhine went beyond its immediate military effect. It showed that technological surprise could be achieved not with secret weapons but by mass-deploying capabilities enemies ignored. After the war, military doctrine included Rhine lessons. NATO plans in the Cold War emphasized amphibious vehicles to cross Eastern Europe's rivers. The Soviet Union built whole families of amphibious vehicles, learning from American success. Modern armies see river crossing ability as essential, not specialized beyond the military. The Rhine crossing proved American production. Philosophy: quality mattered less than quantity if quantity was enough. Perfection mattered less than availability. Sophistication mattered less than reliability. These lessons shaped post-war American industry far beyond the military. The Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe reflected DUKW thinking: massive standardized aid rather than customized. Solutions: the interstate highway. System used military logistics lessons for civilian roads. The space race focused on reliable mass-produced parts over handcrafted perfection. Perhaps the DUKW's greatest impact was psychological. German soldiers and civilians saw Americans forces treating the sacred Rhine like a small inconvenience. This casual show of industrial power convinced Germans of defeat faster than any. Propaganda post-war interviews with German civilians told the same story. They expected Americans to be stopped at the Rhine for weeks or months, giving time for miracle weapons or negotiations. Instead, Americans crossed in 3 days using vehicles Germans didn't know existed in such numbers. The shock was deep and lasting. Frau Elizabeth Becker, who lived near Vasil, recalled, "We heard the artillery on March 23rd. Terrible thunder all night. We expected weeks of battle." On March 26th, American trucks were driving past our home, still wet from crossing. My father, a Great War veteran, saw them and said, "When your enemy can drive trucks through rivers, the war is over." He was right. This psychological collapse made Germans accept defeat and occupation faster. Resistance that might have formed never appeared. The American industrial display at the Rhine showed Germans that resistance was pointless, not because of military loss, but because of technological failure. Winston Churchill, who crossed the Rhine himself, gave the clearest judgment in his memoirs. The Rhine crossing of March 1945 was not just breaking Germany's last barrier, but showing a new type of warfare. Americans, with their amphibious trucks, solved by industry what Europeans tried to do with strategy. They didn't defeat the Rhine. They ignored it, watched those awkward vehicles, part boat, part truck, completely effective streaming across waters that had protected Germany since Rome's legions. Each DUKW carried not just soldiers, but proof of American industrial power. In my life, I have seen many military inventions: the machine gun, the tank, the aircraft. But few impressed me as much as those simple swimming trucks at the Rhine. They were not about technical brilliance, but organizational genius, not German-style perfection, but American-style practicality. When I stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine on March 25, 1945, watching DUKWs come out of the river like creatures evolving from water to land, I knew I was seeing not just the end of the war, but the start of the American century. On May 7, 1945, just 6 weeks after the Rhine crossing, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Rams. Among the reasons he gave for Germany's defeat was the enemy's unexpected amphibious power at the Rhine. This note, buried in long explanations about strategic bombing and Soviet pressure, showed the true impact of the crossing. General Eisenhower's final report as Supreme Commander gave major credit to the DUKW. No single piece of equipment helped more in the fast conquest of Germany than the amphibious truck. It turned rivers from barriers into highways, changed logistics from a limit into an advantage, and shortened the war by weeks, if not months. The last operational DUKW crossing of the Rhine happened on May 10, 1945, 2 days after Germany surrendered. It carried not soldiers but food for German civilians in isolated areas cut off by destroyed bridges. The vehicle that broke Germany's last military barrier had become a tool for humanitarian help. Private First Class Anthony DeMarco, driving that last DUKW, remembered, "No shooting, no artillery, just driving across like a Sunday cruise. German kids waited on the eastern bank, hoping for chocolate. 4 months earlier, their fathers would have been trying to kill us. Now we were bringing food. That's what those ducks did. They made the impossible." normal enemies into people who needed help. The Rhine crossing of March 1945 stands as a landmark moment in military history, not just for tactics or strategy, but for what it showed about changing warfare. The DUKW, awkward, unarmored, ordinary, made irrelevant a barrier that had protected Germany for 2,000 years. German defenders prepared for every contingency their doctrine imagined, but never thought American industry could produce over 21,000 vehicles that made rivers meaningless. They prepared for the wrong war, not because of incompetence, but because they could not imagine American productive power. The Rhine wasn't conquered. It was made useless by industry. The hundreds of DUKWs that crossed the Rhine between March 23rd and 31st, 1945, carried more than soldiers and supplies. They carried proof that American mass production could change the basic rules of warfare. Every German soldier who saw a DUKW drive up the Rhine's eastern bank saw the end of traditional military limits. Field Marshal Montgomery summed up the operation. Simply, we didn't assault the Rhine. We commuted across it, turning the extraordinary into the ordinary, the impossible into the routine. Was the DUKW's real victory. The Rhine crossing showed that in modern war, industrial power properly used could do what military genius alone could not. The Wehrmacht, maybe history's most professional army, was defeated not by better strategy or tactics, but by swimming trucks made on Detroit assembly lines. In the end, the German defenders were right about one thing: the Rhine could not be crossed by traditional methods against determined troops. They just never imagined that American industry could make traditional methods useless. The DUKWs that swam the Rhine in March 1945 didn't just move soldiers, they carried the future of warfare, where industrial strength beats geography, where mass production beats craft perfection, and where practical innovation beats rigid doctrine. The Rhine crossings' real lesson wasn't military but industrial. In total wars of the 20th century, victory went not to the best soldiers but to the best factories. The German defenders never knew Americans had amphibious trucks to cross the Rhine, not because of bad intelligence but because they could not imagine such abundance. That blindness of imagination, more than any tactical mistake, doomed the Third Reich's last stand at Germany's sacred river.